For the love of God, Montresor! I'm Josh Crowley. Or am I? I want you to remember 3 words. Are you ready? Hashtag never Bernie. But I'll get back to that in a bit. So, Will Chapo, of the Trap House Chapos, made a tweet a while back about how he won't vote for anyone but Bernie Sanders in the general election. Predictably, the vote blue no matter who crowd got angry at him about it. On the surface, I can understand why people might be mad about this. After all, if you don't vote for whichever Democrat happens to be present on the ballot, which is a very high bar, that just makes it 1 vote more likely that Trump will win. It's math, but there's a crucial clue that liberal pundits are missing when they jerk up their knees like they're auditioning for the Rockettes. Sentiments like Will's aren't instructions, they're reflections. If people stay home on voting day, it's not because they listen to Will Menaker or Susan Sarandon or whoever. They're doing it because they already feel alienated by our political system, as if their participation doesn't matter. And when you look at what happened in Iowa alone, it's hard to blame them for feeling like this entire process is completely full of shit. Only about 60% of eligible voters actually voted in the last 2 presidential elections, and fewer people voted in 2016 than 2012. The difference is smaller than 1%, but it proves the whole "you have to vote, look how bad Trump is" strategy isn't an effective motivator. So instead of scolding leftist podcasters on Twitter, it might be more productive to actually examine why 40% of the population doesn't cast a ballot, and more importantly, what might motivate them to do so. We've seen a lot of voter suppression, but I'll address that in a separate video because it deserves its own discussion. For now, let's discuss people who actually decide not to vote. I watched a really great documentary a few weeks ago about the myth that progressive policies don't appeal to the Midwest working class. It contains a staggering statistic. In Milwaukee alone, 88,000 fewer black voters turned out in 2016 than 2012. And the reason they gave was largely that they didn't feel like politicians gave a shit. Maybe Hillary shouldn't have skipped campaigning in Wisconsin after all, huh? I'm sure most of them were well aware that Trump is a huge racist. But see, here's a secret. What if I told you that our entire government was racist in an underlying infrastructural way that makes far more of a day-to-day difference in marginalized people's lives than whether or not our president says dumb, shitty things about people of color on Twitter? See, for many liberal pundits, Trump is America's first bad president, which explains why they seem to think the massive structural changes Bernie Sanders proposes are somehow extreme or over the top. They see Trump as a cause rather than a symptom, as if the oppression and racism and sexism hasn't been baked into the very fabric of our government from the start and systemically reinforced by whichever party's been in power. They think our government is inherently noble and has merely been corrupted somehow over the years, forgetting that it was established by slave owners atop land stolen through genocide. Kind of explains why Hamilton is so popular among liberals, despite all our presidents being some of history's greatest monsters. A primary is the best time to establish what our boundaries are. To quote Luke O'Neill, whose newsletter you should definitely subscribe to, by the way, "If we're haggling over the price of something, I don't come into your store and reassure you right off the bat that I'm going to purchase an item from you no matter what. If I don't like the price, I can just walk out." Until very recently, many Democrats opposed gay marriage rights. Do you think they changed their minds due to liberals' pledge to unconditionally vote for them no matter who? Or was it because we made it clear that if they don't support these things, they may not have our votes next time? We need to stop acting as though threatening to not vote is somehow bullying. We're locked into this pattern where we've fearfully conceded what little power we have over politicians. We're not allowed to threaten to not vote anymore because the other guy is so bad, which forces us to ignore all the ways our own politicians neglect and ignore us. Republicans have cruel and terrible philosophies. Democrats will always be able to use fear-mongering over the other guy. If we're not allowed to exercise the only power we have to make politicians actually represent our interests, we might as well not even have elections. And look, we make voting hard here in the US. Even under the best circumstances, it's a pain in the ass to take time out of your day to go stand in line in some smelly middle school in order to fill out some paperwork. And some precincts are understaffed and overcrowded, and people have to wait in line for hours, sometimes outside, in November. And we don't even make it a mandatory federal holiday. One man in Texas waited 7 fucking hours to vote on Super Tuesday. And yet we think the system is somehow fair and represents everyone's interests. Voting is like going to the DMV, but worse, and there's no legal obligation to show up. It's not like you won't be allowed to drive your car if you don't vote. No wonder 40% of the population doesn't bother, especially when it seems like none of the candidates have any interest at all in improving their lives. Nobody's going to feel motivated to show up at the voting booth to decide between "I'm fucked" and "I'm fucked, but at least America won't look as stupid on TV." A lot of people act like it's your white dude privilege speaking to say you won't vote, but what about all the people who just don't vote without saying anything about it online? The reality is that it's often a lack of privilege that leads people to not vote. It's often the result of realizing that your life is just as shitty under Republicans or Democrats, so what's the point? Will Menaker lives in New York City. If he writes in Edward Scissorhands for president, it's probably not going to affect where New York's electoral college votes go. But what he's saying should be taken as a warning about non-voters as a whole, a demographic Democrats should really be trying to motivate. See, had those 88,000 voters in Milwaukee come out again, if even a little more than a quarter of them had voted Democrat, Trump wouldn't have won the state. Hillary lost Wisconsin by only around 22,000 votes. Right now, people all over the country are already making the same decision quietly that Will made loudly, just like they did in 2016 and 2012 and every election. If Democrats want to actually win, they can't just bank on scolding podcasters and Susan Sarandon for not wanting to vote for someone who'd probably leave as many marginalized people out in the cold as another 4 years of Trump. If they truly want to win, they need to embrace the candidate most likely to bring out voters who feel alienated and disenfranchised and neglected by our system. The people who voted before but stopped because they feel hopeless and powerless. Getting mad at people on Twitter won't motivate disenfranchised and alienated non-voters. But the right candidate, one with a half-century history of fighting for the disenfranchised and the marginalized, probably will. The candidate who will tackle infrastructural oppression rather than simply being not as bad as Trump. There are thresholds for motivating everyone in that non-voter 40% to vote, to feel like maybe it'll matter for their lives and their families this time around. But it's certainly not Biden. Centrist Democrats and regular voters from older demographics are going to show up to vote no matter what, but young people probably won't. Voters who feel alienated by our system probably won't. So instead of getting angry and indignant about Bernie or bust, maybe you realize that we're handing you a winning strategy for November. Oh, and by the way, a couple quick tips circling back to those 3 words I told you to remember at the start. 1. People might want to ditch the hashtag #NeverBernies in their profiles before engaging in a glass house brick tossing contest. 2. It's a little ironic to see so many people claiming they're not going to vote in the primary now that their favorite candidate is out, which will only help Biden win and ultimately lead to a Trump victory. We spent the last 3 fucking years getting blamed for Trump's victory, despite more of us showing up for Hillary than Hillary's supporters showed up for Obama. Witnessing this abject lack of self-awareness in people who are openly refusing to vote simply out of spite is pretty flabbergasting. A lot of people need to Google mind blindness and consider the ways it applies to their own thinking. Yowza. Anyway, if you enjoy my content, please subscribe and recommend it to your friends. If you hate it, please recommend it to your enemies. Thank you very much for watching. We all have precious few moments on this planet, and I appreciate that you chose to spend some with me. Until next time, be seeing you. It contains a staggering statistic. Greatest monsters. My chair keeps squeaking. Everyone in that non-voter newsletter, you should unconditionally vote from them. Vote from them. Smelly middle school in order fair and representative of everyone's interests. Hey, stop.